to today's episode of the Law of Self-Defense Show. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branker for Law of Self-Defense. Thank you. Thank you so very much. So today's show may feel a little repetitive because I know we've recently, once or twice in the last month, maybe in this month of January, covered the Texas provisions for the use of force, and including deadly force in defense of property. We're going to be covering that again in this show with a twist now. It's the use of deadly force in defense of someone else's property. So that's what we'll be diving into. We have a video of a robbery at a gas station, someone at the pumps. A bad guy runs up, grabs their stuff, runs away with it. That isn't simple robbery, still a felony. Taking of property with threat or use of force or intimidation. And while the bad guy is fleeing across the parking lot, a dude in a red car, looks like a Cadillac, parked at the curb of the little convenience store there at the gas station, pops out of his car with a gun and shoots the fleeing robber dead. And then the Good Samaritan gets in his car, rides off into the sunset. As far as I know, he has not been identified. All of this happening in the garden spot of Texas known as Houston. Houston, a lot of crime in Houston, folks. More stories out of Houston than I could possibly cover, even if I focused on Houston alone. So that's what we'll be doing today. We'll be looking at that video. There's no gore or anything in the video, but it is kind of remarkable footage. So I thought it would be good content for today's show. And with that said, I'll go ahead and launch the formal start of today's show. I think I will. Here we go. And today's show is brought to you by none other than Law of Self-Defense itself, in the form of our very popular book, Law of Self-Defense Principles, written by me, forward by Mas Ayub. It is the handbook to make yourself hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, your property. Know where the legal boundaries actually are and how the legal system deals with use of force events so that you're not vulnerable to prosecution. Check it out on Amazon, bestseller in its class, 5-star rated. But don't buy it on Amazon. They'll charge you $20 or $25 for the book and shipping and handling. We'll give you the book for free. We only ask that you cover the cost of shipping the book to you. You can take advantage of this free book offer at lawofselfdefense.com/free book right on your screen. So what have we got? We have this video. Make sure it's at the beginning. So here's a dude pumping gas at a gas station. By the way, folks, are gas stations exceptionally dangerous places? Yeah, they sure are, for a lot of reasons. One is you're there with a very valuable object, right? If nothing else, you're there with your car. You probably have stuff in the car. You're probably checking your messages on your $1,000 cell phone. Plus, there's a lot of vision obstacles where people can sneak up, or if they're fleet of foot, like this robber is, simply dash up. There's another crime that apparently has become very popular in Houston that they're referring to as sliding. That's where you're in your car or by your car. You're distracted in some manner, and the bad guy sneaks up, crouching on the far side of your car, pops open the door, grabs whatever they can, and runs off. That could be your purse, your laptop case, your cell phone. They just sneak in and grab it. Apparently, it's happening multiple times a day throughout the Houston area. So you probably have your wallet in hand because you're paying for gas, so that can be grabbed as well. All kinds of opportunity for a surreptitious ambush type of robbery attempt or theft attempt on you. Now, we should think of gas stations kind of as watering holes for humans, right? So in the wild, watering holes are where predators hang out to pick up meals because they know the prey animals need to get water. So they'll hang up by the watering hole, and when the prey animals show up to slurp, 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 kabam, the predator has a meal. Well, gas stations are watering holes for people, right? Well identified places of exceptional risk and vulnerability for the law abiding at the hands of criminal predators. So that's what's going to happen here. We're going to see this guy at the pump. The robber is going to run in from the right-hand side. There'll be a brief struggle. Presumably, some piece of property is taken, and the robber now flees. And as he's fleeing, he gets about halfway across the screen, back to the right, when we see a man emerge from what looks like a red Cadillac and shoots him dead. And I have to say, it's a remarkable shot. So let's go ahead and play the video. It's only about 11 seconds long. 11 seconds from when this robber decided to dash across the parking lot to commit a felony robbery, and when he was dead. He had no idea he had less than 11 seconds to live, but he did. Here we go. There's no audio. There's the robber, grabs some stuff, felony robbery, running away, bam, right there. That is one hell of a shot, folks. I consider myself fairly skilled with a handgun, and I would have a very low degree of confidence that I would be making that shot, which means I probably wouldn't be taking that shot, not in these circumstances, but we'll circle back to that again later. So this dude then gets in his car and drives away. To my knowledge, he has not yet been identified, may never be identified. But what did he do? He shot another person. For what reason? To prevent a robbery in defense of the victim's property? Because that's what it looks like here. Now, could this possibly be lawful? And let's presume this robber at this moment, when he shot, is not presenting as a threat to anybody. So it's not self-defense. What could be the legal justification? I mean, if there was a threat to persons, if the robber was armed with a gun, for example, perhaps you could argue that he's still a threat to persons. He's in the process of fleeing from a felony crime armed with a gun. But let's presume, and then we would have what? A self-defense or defense of others justification, a defense of persons justification. But let's presume that's not the case, that this was a strong arm robbery, so no weapon was involved. And now with the robber in flight, he's not presenting as a threat to anybody. What could be the other justifications? Well, one might be, for example, Florida's provision that allows for the use of deadly force, not just in defense of persons, explicitly, the normal 5 elements of self-defense, legal justification. By the way, this is available for free, folks. These are the elements that make up any claim of justified use of force in defense of persons. If you don't understand these 5 elements, you can't possibly understand use of force law. And we make this little cheat sheet available for free, lists the 5 elements, and provides a brief description of each. There's the link there in the bottom of the screen, lawofselfdefense.com/elements. We don't charge a penny for this. It's just a PDF download. So that's for defense of persons, defense of yourself, defense of others. Defense of persons law is fairly consistent across the 50 states. But if we don't have a threat to persons, well, Florida has a provision that allows for the use of deadly force if the elements of defense of persons are met, or to prevent a forcible felony. Well, robbery would be a forcible felony. In fact, Florida explicitly lists robbery as a forcible felony. The wrinkle might be that a prosecutor might argue, well, the robbery was over. Now, technically, it's not over. Technically, the robbery is not over until the robber has effectively secured the property. Here, the robbery is still in progress. Certainly, that's what I would argue in Florida for the defender here, for the Good Samaritan here. What if we didn't have that forcible felony provision that Florida has? Well, then we'd have to look at a pure defense of property argument. Now, in 49 states, defense of property may be permissible. It's much more restricted. Even just using non-deadly force to defend property is much more restricted than is the use of non-deadly force in defense of yourself or defense of others. There can be conditions on whether it's your property or whether it's the property of a family member or whether it's the property of a stranger or whether the property is in your possession. So highly restricted privileges to use force, even just non-deadly force in defense of property. And 49 states say there is zero privilege to use deadly force in defense of property in the absence of a threat to persons. Obviously, if there's a threat to persons, then it's a defense of persons justification. But if it's just a threat to property without a threat to persons, say that slider type of theft that I just talked about, or say, for example, this victim here had rested a jacket on the hood of the car or a cell phone on the top of the car, and the robber just ran up, never touched or threatened the victim at all, and simply grabbed the property and ran off with it. So it's not a robbery now. It's a theft, a simple theft, probably a misdemeanor theft, depending on the value of what was taken. So that's a taking of property, a defense of property scenario in the absence of a threat to persons. 49 states says zero possibility to use deadly force in that scenario. And the one exception, of course, is Texas, as we've covered before, I should say. So where do we find the Texas law on defense of property? Well, we kind of have to work backwards from what we have here, right? So Texas has a provision for protection of another person's property. Let me expand this a bit. And that can be found here. Texas Penal Code 9.43, protection of a third person's property that's not your own. And there are a number of conditions that have to be met. We'll step through this statute. But one of the first conditions that have to be met is, first, you have to be justified under two other statutes. Not both of them, but either of these two other statutes. So this is Penal Code 9.43. In order to be justified in using force to protect a third person's property, some other person's property, you would have to be justified under using force under 941 or 942. So let's take a look at those. Well, 942 is the deadly force in defense of property statute, which we've covered many times in the past. It has its own set of conditions for the use of deadly force to protect mere property in the absence of a threat to persons. But one of the first of those is you have to first meet the conditions of 941. So that means we need to look at 941, which is the use of non-deadly force to protect property. So let's take a look. Here is 941. A person in lawful possession. So the property has to be in your possession. That's the first condition before you can use even non-deadly force in defense of property in Texas, which means, say you go to a restaurant that has one of these common coat racks where everyone in the restaurant hangs up their coat and then they go sit at their individual tables. And you're sitting at a table, on the other side of the restaurant. And someone comes in and takes your coat off the rack. Is that coat in your possession at that time? No. So right then you would not have met this first condition of the use of non-deadly force in defense of property under Texas law. But a person in lawful possession of land or tangible, movable property is justified in using force against another when and to the extent the force is immediately necessary to prevent or terminate the other's trespass on the land or unlawful interference with the property. Okay? A person unlawfully dispossessed of land or tangible movable property by another is justified in using force against the other when and to the degree the actor reasonably believes the force is immediately necessary to re-enter the land or recover the property. So this is the provision that would encompass that coat on the common hanger scenario, because now you're being unlawfully dispossessed of property by another and you're privileged to use force to recover the property. If the actor uses the force immediately or in fresh pursuit after the dispossession, after the taking, and the actor reasonably believes the other had no claim of right when he dispossessed the actor, or the actor accomplished the dispossession by using the other accomplished the dispossession by using force, threat, or fraud against the actor. So these last two provisions, well, sub provision 1 here is for repo cases, right? You stop paying the loan on your car, the bank is allowed to repossess your car. That's the bank having a claim of right. Then, of course, they would send an agent on their behalf, right? A repo guy to come take the car. He's acting on behalf of the bank, so he's got a claim of right to dispossess you of your car. You're not allowed to use force, even non-deadly force, to prevent that, to recover that property, even if you are in fresh pursuit. Or the other party is accomplishing the dispossession by using force, threat, or fraud against the actor. Well, force or threat makes this a threat to person scenario, not a simple defensive property scenario. So, what if you see the person wearing your very distinctive coat a few days later after the taking? Can you use even non-deadly force to recover that property? Not under these provisions, because that's not in fresh pursuit after the dispossession. And it's not using the force immediately following the dispossession. So these are all the conditions for using non-deadly force in defense of personal property under Texas law. So if you meet all these, then you might also be eligible to use deadly force in defense of property under the next sequential statute, 9.42. So let's take a look at the conditions here. A person is justified in using and this is, so far we're talking only about your own property. A person is justified in using deadly force against another to protect land or tangible property if he would be justified in using force under 941, which we just covered. And so you have to meet the second requirement, although there are options, alternatives under paragraph 2. And when and to the degree he reasonably believes the deadly force is immediately necessary to prevent the other's imminent commission of arson, burglary, robbery, aggravated robbery, theft during the nighttime, or criminal mischief during the nighttime. And by the way, this was, if you didn't notice, it certainly appears that this robbery occurred during the nighttime. And most of these, by the way, are actually offenses against people, right? Or to prevent the other who is fleeing immediately after committing burglary, robbery, aggravated robbery, or theft during the nighttime from escaping with the property. Well, that would have seemed to apply here, right? Because you're not preventing the imminent, immediately about to occur. The robbery's, in a sense, completed, maybe not in the sense that the person's in flight from the robbery, and that's usually encompassed as the robbery still being in progress. But certainly, what we have here is a robber in flight. And here we don't even have the nighttime requirement. We didn't either before for the robbery, but certainly this would be encompassed by the scenario we have. And you also have to meet condition 3. The property cannot be protected or recovered by any other means, or the use of force other than deadly force to protect or recover the property would expose the actor or another to a substantial risk of death or serious bodily injury. So certainly B would be met if the robber had a weapon, right? If the robber had presented a weapon, it was an armed robbery, you're not going to close proximity in an effort to recover your property without incurring a risk of death or serious bodily injury. But even if the robber was unarmed, you could still be privileged to use deadly force in self-defense if you reasonably believe that the property cannot be recovered by any other means. And what would be the other means? If the robber runs away, the property is gone forever, right? There is no alternative means of recovering the property. So under these provisions, the victim of this robbery himself would have been privileged to use deadly force to protect his property under Texas law. If he had pulled out his own gun and shot this robber in flight, even if the robber presented no imminent risk of danger to any person, under Texas law, he'd be privileged to use that deadly force to protect his personal property. But that's not what happened. The victim of the car here did not use force himself. Instead, the bystander used force on the victim's behalf. The bystander was using force in defense of another person's property, a third person's property. And that brings us finally to Statute Penal Code 9.43, protection of a third person's property. So a person is justified in using force or deadly force against another to protect property of a third person if, under the circumstances as he reasonably believes them to be, so he doesn't have to be correct, but he has to be reasonable. The actor would be justified under Section 941, non-deadly force in defense of property, or 942, deadly force in defense of property, in using force or deadly force to protect his own land or property. So if the bystander had been in the victim's position, would he have been privileged to use here deadly force in defense of property? I say yes. That seems clear because the victim would have, but there are more conditions that have to be met. And the actor reasonably believes that the consummated theft, the actor reasonably believes the unlawful interference constitutes attempted or consummated theft. Is that the case here? Yeah, of course. This can't look like anything else, especially given the struggle at the car. This doesn't look like anything else except a theft. Now, it's even worse than a theft. It's an aggravated form of theft. It's a robbery. It's a theft that involves the threat or intimidation of the person you're stealing the property from. So that makes it a robbery. But if it's a robbery, it's also, of course, a theft. So that would qualify here. But even if you didn't, there's an alternative. The actor reasonably believes that the third person has requested his protection of the property. So a woman screams, "Oh my gosh, that guy stole my pocketbook," and the dude's running away. "Somebody help me." Now she's requested that bystanders help her defend the property. Or the defender has a legal duty to protect the third person's property. So you're a loss prevention agent, you're a security guard working for the property owner, and therefore you have a legal duty to protect the property. Or the third person whose property it is the defender's spouse, parent, or child, resides with the actor, or is under the actor's care. So there's a special relationship provision there. We don't need any of this Section 2 here because we already qualify under Section 1. That the bystander here would have reasonably believed that the unlawful interference with the victim's property constituted attempted or consummated theft. So, would this bystander, was his use of deadly defensive force against this fleeing robber lawful under Texas law? Almost certainly. Now, he didn't stay around to find out. He left. He killed somebody, and then he left the scene. Is that a bad idea? You know, I don't tell people what to do or what not to do. I'm not telling you not to leave the scene in a scenario like this. I just want you to make an informed decision. If you flee for purposes of avoiding identification and accountability, in other words, you're fleeing for some reason other than fleeing for safety, you believe it's dangerous to stay there, so you're going to move to a safe place. But if you flee for purposes other than safety to avoid accountability, identification, you could end up, if they find who you are and everything is recorded. I mean, it's pure luck they didn't get this, apparently they didn't get this bystander's car's license plate when he left, or they would have picked him up already. But if you are identified, you could get a consciousness of guilt jury instruction at your trial, which essentially tells the jury that if the prosecution has claimed that this defendant fled for purposes of avoiding identification and accountability, and if you believe that's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, you, the jury, are allowed to infer that not only does a prosecutor think this defendant is guilty of this killing crime, but the defendant believes he's guilty of this killing crime. He has consciousness of guilt. And that's a pretty damaging jury instruction. And that happens in cases. That happened in the I want to say Michael Dress, but it wasn't the Michael Dress case. It was the loud rap music trial down in Florida, where a guy shot into an SUV with 4 young men in it playing loud rap music, and then he fled. And he never called 911. He killed one of those. So he was charged with murder for the killing, and then 3 counts of attempted murder for the other 3 people in the car. And he fled. He lived 2 hours away. He was staying in town overnight. He went to his local hotel, stayed there, ordered pizza, walked his dog, watched a movie, never called 911. And then he drove home the next day, 2 hours home. What he didn't know was that a homeless guy living in his car in the parking lot of the gas station where that shooting happened got his license plate number. So by the time he got home the next day, there was a SWAT team around his house just waiting for him. And so he got arrested and prosecuted and convicted, ultimately on all counts. And so he's spending the rest of his life in prison. Michael Dunn, that's what it was. Michael Dunn. Thank you, Will. So that's a risk you run when you flee in this way. Now, I mean, why would you flee? Well, because maybe you don't trust the criminal justice system. Maybe you're afraid you'll be the victim of a politically motivated prosecution. Maybe you're like Michael Dunn, an older white dude, and you've shot and killed a young black man. And that's going to lead to protests and riots and a poisoned jury pool and the impossibility of getting anything like a fair and impartial trial. Maybe you don't know whether what you just did was a lawful killing or not. Maybe you've never read Texas Penal Code 941, 942, 943. So you don't actually know. Maybe you have a gut feeling that this was the right thing to do, but there's a lot of scenarios that feel like the right thing to do that are felony criminal conduct. Now, this clip is from a news report, local news station, and they interviewed a bunch of, people when they went to the gas station in daytime to get some B footage for their news story. And several of the people they interviewed was like, yeah, this was righteous. This was the right thing to do. We need more people like this bystander. But those people haven't read Penal Code 941, 942, or 943. I guarantee you, they're saying it's the right thing to do from an emotional position, not from an informed legal position. And maybe that's what the bystander did too. So he actually doesn't know if he just murdered somebody legally. Almost certainly not. But again, you can be absolutely right. Your conduct can be absolutely consistent with the law. But remember, nobody evaluating your use of force after the fact knows what actually happened, knows the truth of the use of force event in any absolute sense. We can't. I mean, this is about as close as we get. And even if you did everything 100% right, there's always the possibility of getting convicted if you're put in front of a jury. Always. The risk of conviction is never zero. So then we have to ask ourselves, even if we had listened to this show and we looked at Penal Code 941, 942, 943, and we knew with absolute legal certainty that this would be a good, lawful killing, do we do it? Would we do it? Would you be willing to kill someone over someone else's property, even if there was no risk of conviction? Now, you might say yes. That's fine. That's a moral question. It's not really a legal question. But of course, there's never zero risk of conviction. So what's in the balance here? The value of whatever piece of property is being taken, which could be a wallet, a cell phone, not insubstantial, but not irreplaceable. It's not a human life. And balanced against that is the possibility that you spend the rest of your life in a Texas prison without possibility of early release. When I do that math, it makes me extremely reluctant to risk the rest of my life in a cage over someone else's piece of personal property. I'm not telling any of you what to do. I just want you to make an informed decision. All right, folks. So that brings us to the Q&A portion of the show, which is for Law of Self-Defense members only. So we've been streaming to our members on the member dashboard at lawofselfdefense.com, but also on YouTube, Twitter, and Rumble. And the YouTube, Twitter, and Rumble streams are about to end. The good news is you can stay with us. You can go to the Law of Self-Defense members live stream, stay with us for the Q&A portion of the show. All you have to do is be a Law of Self-Defense member, which you can do for 99 cents, folks, less than $1 to be a Law of Self-Defense member for a 2-week trial period. So that's a 2-week trial at lawofselfdefense.com/trial. Get unlimited access to all the members only content we do, the the transcripts we provide to our members, the original source videos, the cases we cite, all of that. 99 cents for a 2-week trial at lawselfdefense.com/trial. And after the 2 weeks, if you stay a member, and virtually everybody does, it's still dirt cheap to be a Law Self-Defense member. It's only about 30 cents a day, less than $10 a month, folks, to get members access to the 20 to 25 shows that we do a month on varied use of force content. Check it out, at least for the 99-cent 2-week trial. You'll get emailed immediately instructions on how to join us for the remainder of this show and every other members-only content that we produce. Again, that's at lawofselfdefense.com/trial. Now, for those of you who are Law Self-Defense members watching on the dashboard, don't go anywhere. We will continue with the live stream, but if you're on YouTube, Twitter, or Rumble, your show ends here. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you all again soon, or joining us on the live stream. Here we go.